Assalamu alaikum. We are very honored to have Professor Jonathan Brown with us here today from Georgetown University. We have received a number of questions which we would like to ask him, benefiting from his presence. I'll go straight into the questions so we don't waste any time. The first question that's been asked is to evaluate authenticity in Hadith. We have text and testimony. So we have the testimony, which is we check the authenticity of the isnad by looking at the rijal and so forth, and check if those narrators are weak or not. And then we also have the text, which is looking at the text and its proportionality to rationality and maybe some other things. So looking at the isnad is fairly straightforward. We check the books of rijal to see if these narrators are authentic or if they're not authentic. But how do we assess, or what is the criteria to evaluate the rationality or the soundness of a text in Hadith?
Well, hello, Muslims in Great Britain. This is obviously a very important question. It's occupied a great deal of my thought over the years that I've been Muslim, and the answer is fairly straightforward. So when people talk about isnads and chains of transmission and rijal, the whole reason this science was developed by Muslims, and it's fairly unique science in world history. I mean, it doesn't have really a parallel or anything that comes close to matching it in other either religious or even historical traditions. And the reason it was developed is because of the problem of using regular human reason to evaluate claims of attributed revelation. So how do you use your pitiful little brain, or my normal human brain, to evaluate something that's attributed to somebody who had access to the ghaib, who had access to the unseen, and who is also the source of morality for Muslims. So if somebody comes and tells me, I want you to go over there and hit that guy in the face, I'm going to say, no, I'm not going to do that. The guy hasn't done anything wrong. But if the Prophet tells you, to go and hit somebody in the face, then it's a very different situation. You can't have the same reaction. If somebody comes and tells you, in 20 minutes, the sky is going to fall on our head, you say, well, whatever, okay, you don't know the future. But if the Prophet tells you in 20 minutes the sky is going to fall on our head, this is very different because he has access to the ghaib. So some of the two principal means that we have of discerning whether or not reports we hear from other people are reliable, and they come from looking at the contents of what they say, namely sort of our own moral compass, or our own common sense, our own notion of what's possible and impossible. These things just don't apply really when we're dealing with attributions to the Prophet. So one of the challenges Hadith scholars have is they're trying to figure out what's authentically the words of the Prophet, what's not, but they're robbed of some of the main tools that human beings have to do that. They're dealing with someone who is unique, has unique knowledge. So they came up with the system of transmission criticism in order to basically try and figure out a system for evaluating reliability, but one that takes reason out of the equation, one that takes human reason out of the equation. Another reason or another cause for taking reason out of the equation is we know well from the Quran that what is the main cause that has led people astray through generations and various religious communities throughout history is that they start following their ahwa, they start following a dhann instead of haqq, instead of what's been revealed from on high. So reason is a door for our own agendas, our own desires, our own notions of what's right and wrong to creep into a religious tradition. So the early Muslim scholars also wanted to close that door as much as they could. You can never close it completely because you can never switch your brain off. You can never escape your biases completely, or your cultural background completely. But they wanted to close the door as much as possible. Now that being said, they also were very influenced by strong rational traditions, especially after the 900s of the Common Era by the Near Eastern tradition of Greek logic, and there are certain things that are accurate from logic, right? A cannot be A in the same way at the same time. That's accurate. God can't make one 1 plus 1 equal 3. Not because God doesn't have power, but because if you take 1 and 1 and make it equal 3, it's no longer 1 and 1, so the object of change. This is something people talk about in Kalam texts and things like that. But the point is that logic is reason does have certain things that it can offer us when we criticize, when we're trying to evaluate the reliability of things. So by the time you get to the 900s and the 1000s of the Common Era, what's been established as sort of the rules of Sunni Hadith scholarship is that you have anything that is undoubtedly contradicts the Quran, anything that without a doubt contradicts the authenticated Sunnah, the Sunnah Mutawatira, anything that contradicts Ijma', anything that contradicts the basic principles, apodictic principles of reason, like what's called the rule of non-contradiction. A cannot be A and not A at the same time in the same way. And similarly, sort of an interesting historical rule of historical criticism that anything that purports to it reports an event that if it had happened, it would have been reported in a much greater number. So if you have one solitary report saying that an event happened, and if that event had really happened, it would have been reported much more widely, that's also false. What's a great example of that? The Satanic Verses. The story of the Satanic Verses, you only have really one narration of this. And yet, if this had happened, the enemies of the Prophet would have been celebrating right, left, and center, and it would have filled books of history. So certainly, Islamic books of history. So that's a great argument for the inauthenticity of that report. So what do you do in the end? I'd say the general rule that Sunni scholars have followed, and like any people who are using their reason or trying to come up with best judgment in a scholarly issue, there's going to be a range of opinions. So you see some Muslim scholars, let's say Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi, much more likely to be willing to do metin criticism. Other scholars, like let's say Asyuti, very reluctant to do metin criticism, content criticism. But generally, the idea is, if a report is reliable, has been reliably transmitted, you have to find some way to reconcile its meaning with what you know to be true, either with reason or the appropriate sources of Islam. So if you come across a hadith that seems to be reliable, but it says something, that's theoretically problematic, right? Or it says something that seems to contradict the Quran, or says something that seems to contradict the Sunnah, something that seems to contradict reason. You have to exhaust all the possibilities. Well, what if I understand this metaphorically? What if I understand this as, addressing the issue in this way and not that way? So only if you've exhausted all the means of interpretation, then you can say, I have no choice but to conclude this hadith is false. It's false. And this happens every once in a while with hadiths. You have hadiths that Muslim scholars just can't accept, even though they have reliable chains of transmission. It's very rare. In general, they're much more likely to look for alternative interpretations. So there was a hadith, like for example in Sahih al-Bukhari, there's a hadith where it talks about when God created Adam, God created Adam and he was 60 arms tall, and ever since then human beings have been decreasing in size. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani in his Fath al-Bari, he says, we look and we see that the houses of the ancient people, like the people of Thamud, the houses that are dug into the cliffs, we see the houses are the same size as our houses. So I don't understand. If they were shrinking, if they were taller than us, why are their houses the same size? And what he says is simply, he says, "Ma wajadtu ma yuzilu hadha al-ishkal hatta الآن." He says, I haven't seen anything yet. I haven't found what solves this problem yet. But he doesn't deny the authenticity of the hadith. He just says, there's probably some explanation. I don't know what it is. And this is a big difference between, I think a lot of modern people, when they come across a religious text that they don't understand or they find problematic, is they immediately reject its authenticity. Whereas someone like Ibn Hajar would say, or Suyuti would say, فَوْقَ كُلِّ عِلْمٍ عَلِيمٍ. There's always someone more knowledgeable than us. And there's a great book by a Syrian scholar named Khalil Mullah Khatir called Al-Isaba fi Sihhat Hadith al-Dubaba. It's about the hadith of the fly landing in your drink and how he argues for its authenticity, both from the perspective of the isnad and the meaning. And he raises a very good point that there's a difference between istib'ad, which is considering something unlikely, and istihala, which is something being impossible, like rationally, logically impossible in and of itself. It's impossible for A to be A and not A at the same time, the same way. That's impossible. However, lots of things that we say are impossible are just unlikely. They're just unlikely, and every once in a while they happen, and then we see that it's something that could occur, or we doubt that some kind of technology could exist, and then 10 years later that technology exists, and something that seemed unlikely or impossible is no longer so. So that's an important point.
Just leading on to that question, some opponents of Islam have referred to our Hadith corpus as, well, a load of Chinese whispers.
It's just not true at all. I mean, it's not. If you don't trust Muslim scholars, you can look at the work of Harold Motsky. I mean, he's not arguing that all the hadiths are authentic, and that's not his aim or his the scope of his studies. But what he shows is that when these hadiths are not just random. They're not just so and so transmitted this and so transmitted that, just throwing names and places out there. And you can see this very clearly if you go and, if you ever have the time and the inclination to sit down and actually diagram out how a hadith is, claims of transmission work, is that, there's remarkable uniformity, and, we can sit and debate whether or not this hadith is authentic and things like that, but the material that's on the page, the data itself, is generally reliable, because there's a uniformity there and a consistency there that you just don't get if you just started making names up or saying, oh, so-and-so heard this from so-and-so. You wouldn't be able to keep that kind of consistency.
Okay, second question is, how do we eradicate the influence of extremist ideologies, especially those grouped and financed by the West's top ally Muslim states, either in Saudi Arabia or whatever, getting arms from them, maybe in Syria, maybe elsewhere. So I think that's what the concern of the questioner is, that America is using Muslim states who are on its side to form terrorists in.
I would say that it's a difficult question, because you can't live in a world, it would be impossible to create an environment in which nobody could interfere with your life from the outside. People, communities, countries will always face the potential for foreign interference. I think that if one has a fear of that in one's own life, then you have to be aware of its possibility. You have to be willing to turn down money even when it seems like you'd like some. Sometimes money is not always the best thing. You have to be willing to say no, because it comes with strings attached in order to keep your independence. And when it comes to looking at a situation or a country where there's some conflict and there's a lot of outside tampering, I think that you just have to be very aware of the consequences of supporting one side or another. So it's no longer just about, I like this side, so I want this side to win, because you have to see, well, what is, who wants that side to win? What is the agenda behind, what is the chain of events we put into play by that side winning because of outside interests? I think it just requires another level of complexity in one's analysis. But it's not possible to. I just don't think it's possible to eliminate that in life. I think that the best you can do is in your own life or your own community, to the extent that you have influence, is to say, we really need to try and guard our independence. And that means sometimes you're going to have to say no to funding, or say no to some kind of help, or say no to assistance you could otherwise use, because autonomy is more important.
The next question is, have some modern Sufis or Sufi groups driven Muslims away from Islam, contrary to the Sufis we read about who drew people to Islam in the past?
Debating the positives and negatives of different aspects of Sufism is a big issue, and we could sit and discuss what are some of the excesses of Sufi traditions, both historically and today, and we probably come to, you'd probably be a lot of people who agree that certain practices are unacceptable. Many Sufis as well. But the question specifically, I think, assumes that a lot of people are being driven away by excessive Sufi practices. I don't have empirical data to back this up, just anecdotal data. But I don't see that as actually a big problem. I don't think a lot of people are. I think there's a lot of people who get interested in Islam because of Sufism, and actually because of aspects of Sufism that some Muslims don't find acceptable. So I think that is maybe a faulty premise. Now, that doesn't, the truth or falsehood of a certain practice in Islam doesn't depend on whether or not it attracts outside followers. That's an extrinsic issue that has no bearing on the validity of a practice for Muslims. I mean, a great way to get people to turn to Islam would be to, hand out free beer at the mosque. We're not going to do that just to make people become Muslim. It's hard to pray Fajr. You're not going to tell people you don't want to pray Fajr just so that they can stay in Islam. So, I think that you have to break the link between attracting outsiders and the correctness of a practice.
What about internally, like with charlatan type Sufis and cultish type?
That's a problem, but that's a problem, by the way, that you look back at some of the greatest internal critiques within Sufism, like Talbis Iblis ibn al-Jawzi himself was a serious Sufi. If you look at even Shamsuddin Tabrizi, the teacher of Jalaluddin Rumi, he says that one of his books, attributed to him, that he would much rather hang out with fuqaha than with these dervishes, because fuqaha actually do stuff and talk about things of substance, and the dervishes just spinning around, or not spinning around, but sort of staring into space and saying weird things. So there's a tremendously rich internal criticism, a tradition of internal criticism within Sufism that is, and one of the things that they're very wary about, and they have always been very wary about historically, is a charlatan teacher. And that's why you always hear the phrase, al-istiqama khairu karama. That, someone's going to come and they're going to give you these karamats and all these things. That's why they always say, it doesn't matter. It's attributed to Bayezid al-Bastami when someone came and told him, there's some new saint who came to town, there's some new wali who came to town, you have to see him. And he went and he saw the man spit towards the Qibla. And he said, okay, that's it, that's all I need to know. Wali doesn't do these kind of things. That doesn't matter. Someone can do, someone can come and perform some, fraudulent miracle. If they don't have istiqamah, it doesn't matter. And someone who has istiqamah, that's someone you should follow, regardless of whether or not they're a wali or whatever. Someone who should be imitated.
The next question, is there a non-coincidental pattern in the uprisings in the Muslim Arab world? How do you see things going forward? Is it a time for concern, or is it a time for optimism?
It's always a time for concern and always a time for optimism. I guess that's how I would, how I try to live my own life. I'm not sure if I do it very well, but I think that obviously the causes of these Tunisia, Egypt, and Syria have very similar causes, namely governments that had neglected a large percentage of the population's economic well-being. In Egypt, tremendously widespread poverty throughout the country. In Tunisia, especially outside the major cities on the coast, and in Syria, especially outside of Damascus, the regime, especially in the last 10 years, had simply not been sharing enough of the wealth with or economic activity with people in places like Jeddah, where the uprising started. So I think that the cause is in these different countries. They have this very similar cause. One, economic disenfranchisement. Two, governments that don't care about that, don't do anything about it, and also just generally don't have any accountability to the population. So people want accountability, and that's what people rose up in the name of. In terms of what will happen in the future, it's always, a country like Egypt, which I have very strong feelings about. It is very well known, and you can see this throughout history when you look at revolutions. Regimes don't go down easily. You don't just go and kick some guy out of office and that's it. There's an entire establishment. There's an entire social economic structure behind that regime, and that is not going to go easily. And it's going to manufacture a situation in which it can excuse its return. And this is precisely what's happened in Egypt. That shouldn't be a surprise. This is something that happens in almost any revolution I can think of, and people shouldn't lose hope because of that. Because a country like Egypt is a great country, with wonderful people, and they have the potential to really be a leader in the Muslim world and in the world in general. What's happening there right now is breaks my heart on a minutely basis. And it's my hope that enough people in Egypt will wake up to what's happened, because I don't think, it is somewhat ridiculous when you're about to prosecute a president, a democratically elected president who was in power for 1 year and killed basically nobody, and you've just let the former president, who's a dictator and a kleptocrat for 30 years, presided over the murder and torture of countless thousands of people. And just 4 to 5,000 people have just been killed in the streets, innocent people massacred, and people are accepting this. This is nonsense. But it's my hope that eventually, hopefully very soon, enough people in Egypt will wise up to this, to see that this is not the direction that they wanted their country to go when they rose up against Mubarak in 2011. As for the other countries, Syria is a very, very tragic situation. And it's so confusing, I simply don't know what to say about it.
Perhaps a related question about the Islamic State or Islamic law, state law. Should all Muslim countries follow the example of Turkey and become officially secular, leaving religion a private affair and having nothing to do with the state?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think that the one thing we have to keep in mind is that it's almost impossible for a government to have nothing to do with religion, okay? Because, I'll tell you why. Because religion influences culture. Okay? Culture shapes law. So in the United States, a lot of times in a lot of states and counties, liquor stores are closed on Sundays. Why is that? It's because Sunday is a Christian holiday. In America, there is a very strong aversion since the mid-1800s to polygamy. Really strong aversion. I mean, Americans are really creeped out by polygamy. Why is that? This is definitely, Western European Christian tradition. It doesn't have a rational legal basis behind it. So, laws are shaped by culture. Cultures are influenced and sometimes strongly influenced by religion. So I don't think you can say that, we want a society in which, let's say Islam is not going to affect law at all. Because if your culture is strongly influenced by Islam, if you have a majority Muslim culture, and your law in some ways reflects the will of the people, then it's going to reflect some Islamic sentiments. I mean, when a lot of times people say that Muslims should be secular, or a Muslim state should be secular, they say, well, you can't have laws that require women to wear hijab or something like that. Well, I mean, if you have a country where 99% of the people, or 90% of the women wear hijab, and 99% of the people vote for a law that says that women should have to wear hijab, why is it so difficult to excuse a law that says women should have to wear hijab? In the United States, women can't walk around topless. In the state of Ontario in Canada, men can't jog with their shirts off. We don't sit around saying that the state of Ontario in Canada or the United States are barbaric because women can't walk with their tops off, or men can't jog with their shirts off. This is something that those societies have enshrined in their laws because it represents, general social consensus. What you have in Muslim countries is you have, let's say, a country like Egypt where 85% of the women wear hijab, at least according to The Economist. 85% of women wear hijab, and you have, why is it? Why does 15% of the population, let's say 15% of the women who don't want to wear hijab, why did they get to decide, dress norms for the country when the majority doesn't agree with them? Or, I'm just thinking theoretically. So my point is that you can have, even if you were to have a constitution that said, the state has no official religion, religion is a private affair, if someone wants to come and pass a law that's based on Islamic sensibilities in the society, by what right do you deny that law's validity? I mean, provided you're not restricting the rights of people to practice their religion. So let's say you want to, pass a law that says, Christianity is prohibited in Egypt. Of course, this is unacceptable. Because if you say, religion is a private matter, then you can't tell people they can't practice a religion. But if you want to pass a law that dictates dress, or that dictates, let's say, how inheritance is divided, and that's informed by Islamic sentiments or Islamic principles, by what right constitutionally would you prevent that? So I think this is, I think that it's certainly very attractive in this day and age to have a constitution that doesn't include some kind of statement about religion, or where the state doesn't have an official religion, because it helps you deal with the problem of religious minorities. It helps you deal with the problem of religious diversity. But I think that even if you do that, and you're trying to somehow create some state where no one is going to be forced to do anything they don't want to do, you're still going to have, if you have a majority Muslim population or a large or plurality of Muslims, it's not inconceivable. In fact, it's quite likely that people are going to try and pass laws that have some Islamic basis. I don't see any way you could prevent that.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from someone who says, I've got a background in science, and my question is if we can reconcile the Islamic creation story with evolution.
I don't understand this debate. To be honest, this is a trap. This is a trap. This is what happened to Christians in the United States in the 20th century, where somehow, although Christians from the time Darwin, I think he wrote his book in 1859, if I'm not mistaken. In the decades after that, actually a lot of Christian leaders and theologians had no problem with Darwin's ideas. They just they came up with ways to reconcile this with biblical stories. But then once it became resisting Darwinism or rejecting Darwinism became synonymous with being religious, and accepting Darwinism became synonymous with kind of being scientific and anti-religious. Now you have a choice. Either you're religious or you're scientific. Well, what if you want to be both? This is a false dilemma. This is something that's been set up as a trap for you to fall into. That's not fair. That's not necessary, and it's ridiculous. And science is such a powerful force. The idea of reason and empirical studies are such a force in our society today. If you go and tell some young Muslim, you need to choose between Islam and science, you're asking them to kind of resist the most powerful force in their society in the name of their religion, when there's no need for them to do that. Because I do not know any Muslim scholar until, let's say, the late 1800s. Not a single Muslim scholar throughout Islamic history was ever declared a kafir or a heretic for scientific discovery. They could get in trouble for philosophical ideas or something like that, but for empirical study, this was never a problem for Muslims, because it was always assumed that anything you discover in the world around you is going to be ayat Allah that are compatible with the ayat of God in the Quran. And there's let's say we discover that human beings evolved from some previous species. So what? What does that change? Nothing. What about the stories in the Quran? Well, they could be figurative, or maybe, and if you're an Ash'ari, if you believe in, constant recreation of the world, then, it's entirely possible, this is just my own theory, it's entirely possible that, you have, ape starts getting bigger and starts walking and, eating bananas and using rocks to cut bananas and things like that, and then at one instant, because God's constantly recreating the world at every instant, at one instant, he could recreate the world and have that be Adam. Why not? I don't see, especially if that's your kind of view of existence, of dunya existence, I don't see how you could very easily reconcile, Islamic scripture with the idea of evolution. So I personally think this is a canard. This debate is something that is dropped in the lap of people of faith, of religious communities, and they basically bite this bait. And then they destroy their own community. They cause ruptures in their own community when it's not necessary.
Okay, final question. According to some Sunni sources, Imam Ali burnt alive some people to death as a punishment, whereas according to the Shi'i sources, this is deemed not to be true. And there is also Hadith in our Sunni tradition, Bukhari, that the use of fire is the exclusive preserve of Allah Ta'ala. So is this true? Did Imam Ali carry out this punishment?
Anytime you're dealing with story. So this is going to be outside of the Hadith corpus. The story of, I think, is referring to Ali's supposed punishment of Abdullah bin Saba. So Abdullah bin Saba is this figure who appears during the First Civil War, and the reports differ on him. Some say he's a Jew who's converted to Islam. Some say he's other things, but he is sort of he's seen as the source of a lot of sectarian evil in the Islamic tradition, to the extent that some Western scholars think that he didn't even exist because he's such a catch-all for all the sectarian problems that emerge in the First Civil War. So Ali captures him and punishes him, supposedly by burning. Now, these stories, that appear in histories like the history of Tabari and things like this, these are not recorded or authenticated with the same rigor as reports about ahkam for praying and fasting and buying and selling that you find in a book like Bukhari and Muslim. So that's a first thing. If somebody doesn't want to accept this story, I can't, from my perspective as a Middle East historian, I can't tell them that they're wrong. They probably have a very good reason for being suspicious of the story. However, there's another report about Ali when it's in Sunan al-Bayhaqi and other books as well. Abu Bakr. So I was saying that there's a report in the Sunan al-Bayhaqi that Abu Bakr, when he's caliph, there's someone who's captured, brought in for committing sodomy and liwat, and Abu Bakr asked people what their punishment should be, and Ali says, this is a crime that no one, only one group has committed before, and you know very well what their punishment was. So Ali suggests that the person should be burned. That's not the punishment Abu Bakr chose. But that report is mursal hadith. It's not a reliable report. But those are the reports I know of. And of course, as you noted, the ultimate or sort of definitive position or hadith on this issue is the one of Abu Hurairah in Sahih Bukhari, where the Prophet tells him, the group of companions, not to burn people with fire, because only God punishes people with fire. Which is actually, if that were, I've always thought if that were actually implemented in, globally, we would get rid of a lot of the most devastating and horrendous ways of killing and maiming, which all involve fire. Imagine a world without explosives being used in war. It would be a much more humane one. Anyway, that's just my pipe dream, I suppose.
Okay, Jazakallah, Professor Jonathon Brown, for answering the questions. And we hope maybe in the future we will get another opportunity to ask some questions.
Anytime. I love the UK.
Great.
Assalamu.
Okay, Jazakallah. Assalamu.